Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the webinar this evening. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Marisol LeBrón. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Mexican American and Latino Studies, and I'm also a member of the editorial collective for NACLA. So I'm going to do some quick introductory kind of remarks, introducing the panelists and the co-sponsors for this evening. And then we'll launch into what I think is going to be a really fantastic discussion about policing, anti-Blackness, and empire in the Americas and the intersections between them. We have some really fantastic panelists this evening. So the event for tonight is originating and sponsored by NACLA, which is, for folks who are unfamiliar with us, the North American Congress on Latin America. NACLA is an independent nonprofit that works towards a world in which the nations and peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean are free from oppression and injustice and enjoy a relationship with the United States based on mutual respect, free from economic and political subordination. NACLA has been, for the last 50 years, the premier source of information, providing English language news and analysis not found anywhere else for journalists, policymakers, activists, students, and scholars in North America and throughout the world. If you want to learn more about us and what we do, and please check out our amazing blog and journal, head over to nacla.org. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for the event this evening, which is the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at NYU, or CLACS at NYU, as well as Colectivo ILE, and Bárbara, who's one of our panelists, can speak a little bit more about the amazing work that they do. But Colectivo ILE works to strengthen anti-racist and decolonial work in Puerto Rico through education, organizing, and research. They form alliances through community organizing with diverse sectors of society in order to affirm African roots and eradicate institutional, cultural, and individual racism. Be sure to follow them on social media and learn more about their work, and we'll hear a little bit more about them this evening as well. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. This evening, we're joined by Bárbara Abadía-Rexach, who's a communication scholar, socio-cultural anthropologist, and Afro-Puerto Rican feminist and anti-racist leader. She pursued a BA and MA in communication from the University of Puerto Rico and a PhD in anthropology from UT Austin. Her academic work explores racialization in Puerto Rico from different cultural productions. She is a member of Colectivo ILE and the Black Latinas No Collective, which folks should also be sure to check out after this webinar. Abadía-Rexach produces the radio program Negras at Radio Universidad de Puerto Rico and collaborates with two journalistic projects, Afrofemininas and Todas. Beginning in August, she will be joining the Latino Studies Department at San Francisco State, and congratulations to Bárbara on the move, forthcoming move. We're also joined this evening, very excited to be joined by Luciana Brito, who is a historian, Black woman movement activist, and identifies herself as a Black intellectual and working class feminist. She's a professor at the Federal University of Reconcavo. I don't know if did I say that right, Luciana? De Bahia, Brazil, specializing in the history of slavery and abolition in Brazil and the United States. She is also interested in the areas of race, gender, and class in the Americas. She's the author of several articles and books, including Temores de África, which will soon be published in English. And you can follow her on Instagram, Luciana Brito Historia. So lastly, but not least, we're joined by Steven Osuna. Steven is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at California State University, Long Beach. His research focuses on the relationship between global and racial capitalism, transnational criminalization, militarization, policing, and social control in the US, Mexico, and Central America. Stephen was born and raised in Echo Park, Los Angeles, and is the son of Mexican and Salvadorian working class migrants. His research has been published in a wide range of scholarly and popular venues. He's a current member of the board of directors of Homies Unidos in Los Angeles, and an organizer with the Human Rights Alliance for Child Refugees and Families, HRA, and the Philippines-US Solidarity Organization of Southern California. So what I'm going to do, the format for this evening is we're going to have a panel discussion for about an hour, and then open it up for Q&A with the audience. So please, if you have any questions, this is meant to be an interactive event. Please put them in the chat. Those will kind of filter through to me by the end of the evening. And definitely also feel free to hit us up on social media as well. So I wanted to start off the panel this evening and start off by asking you all how this current moment helps us to think about how Blackness, race, and state violence are not spoken about or are spoken about in Latin America. As we've seen displays of solidarity and connection between Black communities in Latin America and Black communities in the United States around shared experiences of racial violence, especially at the hands of the police, I've seen two troubling narratives emerge. The first is that the protests and solidarity with BLM in Latin America are a kind of importation of US racial analytics and problems, right? That if it weren't for you know, these pesky US-based racial justice advocates, these problems would not be spoken about or dealt with in Latin America. And the second narrative, which is in some ways equally troubling, is the idea that US Black communities are teaching Latin Americans about Blackness and resistance, right? As if these are not kind of issues that have been at the core of social struggles in Latin America. So both of these takes, which appeared in both kind of US and as well as Latin American media over the past few weeks, seem to reinforce the idea that discussions of race and specifically Blackness in the US versus Latin America are incommensurate in some way, right? Or that Black folks in Latin America haven't been speaking about racialized state violence up until now, right? That it took these protests around the murder of George Floyd to kind of bring about this discussion. So I wanted to hear from you all, how do you make sense of this phenomenon? And we'll start there.
Who should start?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. First, thank you, NACLA, for the invitation, and thanks Marisol and Nestor David and everybody involved. I want to read some answers because I want to straighten the time and not be all over the place. First, I have to say that in Puerto Rico, the anti-racist fight has a long history. This is not something new, and there's plenty of anti-racist organizations and collectives working against racism for decades, inside and outside the island. For example, Ana Irma Rivera Lascens in the 70s, a Black Afro-Latina and lesbian woman and lawyer, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg in the beginning of the 20th century, the John Lord since the 1968, among others. However, we endure a systemic and structural anti-Black racism in the archipelago. There's a rejection embedded in the national discourse of La Gran Familia Puertorriqueña, the celebration of the idea of our mestizaje, has been trying to erase the reality of racial inequality. Thousands of visible Black people as me in Puerto Rico survive. Here we are tired, at least I am, of discussing on a daily basis the two texts you mentioned. We need to prove constantly why and how the Black Lives Matter movement applied to Puerto Rico. Actually, as a US colony, we need to import some race analytics and problems that helps us understand that our context is not too different from US particularities. So it's a trouble, but I feel like reflecting on that question, since we are a colony and we think that people here in Puerto Rico says everything happens there. In Puerto Rico, we don't have that. And we can prove them wrong, that these also, and we need to take those examples to analyze our context as well. We need to prove constantly, and why, okay, I read that. For example, when one have had the race variable removed from some statistics, about homeless people and incarcerated people, when the Black population remains under 50%, according to the last two censuses, we need to rethink if we are going to reject those discourses or if we are going to take them to improve our fight. In Latin America, we have been discussing racism, but not enough. In the International Decade for People of African Descent, 2015 through 2024, I believe every Latin American country is learning from each other. I celebrate that in Mexico, they finally added the Afro-Mexican category. I celebrate the conversation I have with Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Colombian colleagues in which we see tons of similarities and we enumerate how the state failed addressing racism in our countries. In summary, in Puerto Rico, the persistent denial of racism contributes to those two texts you mentioned and tries to undermine the work that leaders have been doing denouncing systemic racism.
Thank you, Bárbara. I had a follow-up question for you, and if other folks want to jump in, also this can kind of be a question for the panel, because I think you made a really interesting and really important point around how racial formation is actually playing in to how we're understanding a lot around these kind of moments of police violence and kind of these discussions around race and anti-Blackness. And there's a couple of underlying assumptions, right? One is this notion that mestizaje is the primary mode of racial identification for folks in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So so there's an assumption within that also that kind of anti-Blackness then becomes the primary mode of understanding and enacting race. And I don't know if other folks want to jump in or if you want to respond to that, but I think that this is a really crucial point for us to kind of keep in mind as we're having these discussions, that there is a lot of underlying assumptions about when we're talking about what it means to be Latin American Caribbean that reify these kind of ideas around racial democracy discourses and mestizaje as the primary ways of understanding race in a way that, as you know, occludes the important work that Black activists have been doing.
Hello. I think I'm gonna start to talk now. So thank you, NACLA, for the invitation. Thank you, Marisol and my colleagues. So in Brazil, I'm so impressed about how the narrative is similar, you know, in Puerto Rico is similar to Brazil. I'm so impressed because as soon as the protests start to be covered by Brazilian media, the first narrative that was created, and I have to say that the protesters of the Brazilian Black movement are not exposed by the Brazilian media. So as soon as the protesters in the United States started to be shown on Brazilian media, the question was not, since the numbers of police brutality in Brazil are so high, according to the Brazilian Violence Report, over 70% of people attacked by the police, killed by the police in Brazil, over 70% are Black young men. So the narrative that was created in Brazil was like, so what happened to Brazilian Black population that don't react as African Americans? So the narrative that was created was why the Afro-Brazilians are so submissive, since the African Americans know how to fight for their rights, and since we are over 50% of the population and African Americans are only around 13. So this was the first narrative that was created by the media. And I think that, you know, because of the Brazilian history of, as may you guys know, of neglecting racism, adopting this narrative of a mestiçagem and this soft kind of racism, what was subliminal to this narrative was like, oh, maybe our racism is not as hard as in the United States, although we know the numbers of police brutality in Brazil. So one of the things that is important to say is that in the communities where Black boys, kids, and the younger men are killed in Brazil, these populations protest. And most of the times when the media and the state say, oh, those people are protesting because the drug dealers told them to do so. So what is the difference in Brazil, in my point of view, is that we don't have the same power to convince the large Black population that when a Black man, a Black woman, or a child is killed by the police, could be the members of our families, we are a target. This, Marisol, is associated with this idea of mestiçagem because of the way the racial debate was developed in Brazil, gave this impression that this person is not as Black as me. So in a broad context, the population don't have this notion of could it be me? And the second is, oh, maybe this person in fact is associated with drug dealers or committed crimes, since the debate over security and violence in Brazil is a concern of the whole population. So under the excuse of arrest drug dealers and punish people who are criminals, even the Black population supported the police actions unless somebody who is really close to the family was affected. So because of this, answering your question, because of this debate of mestiçagem, this idea of mestiçagem in racial democracy, this, I think, is the biggest challenge in Brazil, is to convince the Black population that has all shades of the color, that when a Black man die, or a Black woman, or a child, has to do with the whole Black population. In the same week that George Floyd was killed, the next week, a teenager, a 14 years old teenager in Rio called João Pedro, he was inside the family's house doing his quarantine, and the police, dozens of police officers got inside the house, shoot randomly, and one of the bullets affect João Pedro, this 14-year-old. So João Pedro's body was taken by the police and he disappeared for 17 hours. So the family found João Pedro. So the question was why we are so touched by what happened to George Floyd, but we don't embrace the same revolt for João Pedro. Why the Brazilian media don't cover João Pedro's death and all the situations around João Pedro's death and gave the same visibility that they gave it to George Floyd. So the situation with the police brutality in Brazil became, for this really sad coincidence of 1 week after, was really exposed and became agenda in Brazilian media. Unfortunately, we are colonized. Even the political agenda was necessary happening in the United States in order to the Brazilian press expose the effects of police brutality in Brazil. Thank you.
I could go next. Yeah. So first of all, thank you all for including me in this conversation and discussion. I'm really happy to be here with all of you and everyone. Hello, everyone, of all the attendees and everyone. So again, my name is Steven Osuna, but as a student of Black radical thought and struggles, I'm currently inspired by the Black working class struggle against the contradictions of a globalized racial capitalism at this moment. Again, the contradictions are all over the place, and they're deadly, right? Where we see COVID-19 and the police violence and the homelessness, for example, here in Los Angeles. but we also see at that contradiction a struggle against it, right? To uplift the dignity of the work of the Black working class. So it really inspires me. And just thinking about the question of mestizaje, and just to throw it in there in this moment I'm talking about, I think of that as a project of racial capitalism, right? As a material consequences of a colonial system, right? That takes its forms in different ways at different moments in history, right? So in this current moment, what does mestizaje legitimate? For me, it legitimates a neoliberal assault that's taken place through structural adjustment, austerity, privatization, and free market fundamentalism that has increased the global wealth of capitalists globally, right? While imperialist plunder has devastated Black and brown communities throughout in Los Angeles, in the United States, but Black communities in Venezuela, in Honduras, right? In Mexico, in Puerto Rico and Brazil, right? And so this global assault through neoliberal restructuring then leads to the stuff that we're seeing in current communities through police violence, right? I think when you back to the previous question that we think about why do we see these two movements separate or as one teaching the other? I think when we think of people, where do they get this information from? And I think for Marisol, you brought the main point to bring up of the question you asked, the word to bring up is media, right? Corporate media. It's not popular media, it's not people's media that people are getting this information, because if it was, we would recognize these struggles. We'd be hearing from the struggles on the ground that are uplifting the struggles of the Black working class in Brazil, in Puerto Rico, in Los Angeles. Rather, we're hearing, for example, my family listening to Univision. What are they gonna tell them, right? They're pretty much erasing the Black struggles throughout the hemisphere, right? So I think it's important to think about where our folks are getting their information from, right? So that the fact that these struggles have existed and there has been, unity for a long time, but at the same time, it's very difficult to do given nation-state borders that oftentimes even influence how we think, right? Our frameworks are oftentimes guided by nation-state, the borders of the state, right? So I think that's important to think about. And again, I think the question you're bringing up is a productive contradiction, though. I think the material conditions of the Black working class struggles throughout Latin America have their specificities, but also their universalities, right? And I think we have to struggle and engage both of those, right? For example, when I think of Honduras and Ofrané, right, the Black fraternal organization of Honduras, and the Garifuna communities struggle against state violence in the form of criminalization of protest and struggle for their land rights, right, against mining, tourism, yeah? We see a specific fight waged by the Garifuna people, but a universal struggle against a globalized racial capitalism, right? So it's particular to their struggle on the ground for them, but there's a universal struggle that they're engaging in. And one of their leaders, right, Miriam Miranda, has been subjected to kidnapping, assault, right, due to her work as a land rights defender. And we see that similar attack on Black activists here, the surveillance, right, the over-policing, like visiting their homes, right, investigating them, right, for their activism, for their organizing. So I think, there's that particularity, but there's also that universality that we need to wrestle with and engage with when thinking of this question that you asked. And I think when we take seriously the work of Cedric Robinson and his archaeology of the Black radical tradition through a materialist perspective, I think, we see that the Black struggles have always been part of feminist struggles, national liberation struggles, class struggles, and land struggles throughout Latin America. They've always been there, as Cedric Robinson reminds us. And I think that's something, again, that if we ignore that or we do not engage it in the US, is a failure of historical investigation, an engagement, not engaging in grassroots efforts, and really neoliberalism in our activist and academic spaces, right? Because the neoliberalism is about just not the ideological idea of the individual, and you're focusing on your own community, right? Your own situation, your own academic publishing that focuses on what you're focusing on, not the struggle for humanity, not the struggle for the Black struggle throughout Latin America. So I think, those are important things to think about when we think of this question. But I do think, corporate media is something that really erases local struggles that all of us have to uplift as scholars, activists, and intellectuals.
I really appreciate the point that you're making, Steven, and thinking about it in relation to something that Luciana mentioned as well, right? Which is like, what's at stake in focusing, for instance, on the killing of George Floyd and coverage of that, right, through mainstream kind of Spanish language media or Latin American media, right, mainstream media. at the expense, right, as like facilitating the erasure of these moments of racial violence and discrimination when they're happening in those countries, right, in these Latin American countries, right, and that serves a purpose, right, which I think, Luciana, which is what you were kind of getting at, which is to position kind of the US as the site where racism resides, right, and to say we don't experience that here, right, and that there is a kind of something at stake, right, in that narrative, right, which I think, you know, Steven, as you're pointing out, allows for all forms of plunder and exploitation and invisibilization, right, of these struggles, right. It works to kind of diminish the reach and the impact and the importance, right, of these struggles. So I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that, or we can move on, but I just think that that's a really, really important kind of point that I see you both kind of highlighting in your comments. So one of the key questions that really animated our desire to put together this panel was to kind of invite you all to think through how we can think about colonialism and empire as a part of these issues, right? And in relation to what we're identifying here as a hemispheric violence, right, against Black people, right? These issues are intimately connected, but questions of Black Lives Matter are often positioned in isolation from anti-imperialist struggle in Latin America and the Caribbean. So how can we think about these struggles in an intersectional manner? How can we think about them in the same frame? And I think, you know, Steven, you started to kind of allude to this a little bit in your comments as well, but I'll throw that out, whoever wants to kind of respond first.
I can start again. So I cannot talk about anti-Black racism in Puerto Rico without contextualizing the colonial status of subjugation under Spain from 1493 through 1898, and since then a colony of the US. And today, July 2020, the US Congress approved La Promesa Act in 2016, and La Junta de Control Fiscal, the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, in order for them to take the decisions regarding our own finances. So this is our context right now. The system of power, the hierarchical structures that allocate Black people in an inferior position, and the humanized representation are still vivid in education, politics, and mass media. So I have some examples. In the Department of Education, the representation that we have in the history books and social sciences are enslaved people. We don't know about other stories about people from Africa. Also in the Department of Health right now with the COVID-19, I heard in a media program the General Surgeon of the United States, she's a Puerto Rican, Antonia Coelho de Novello, and she says it's not important to add the race variable to that discussion because she's a Black Puerto Rican. I don't know how she tried to erase her person as a Latina in US. And it's easy for her to say, well, we shouldn't have that discussion about race because this is dividing. So this is the constant rhetoric that we are listening. Also, we are now doing a boycott to a TV show, La Comay, where the puppeteer, Cobo Santa Rosa, used racist and derogatory slurs against Blacks, women, and LGBTQI+ community. Last week, Noticel, another media, commercial media, opened a section in which systematic racism was displayed in the way in which the presenter addressed the issue of racism from nonsense, a disrespect against a scholar, Palmira Rio Gonzalez. The N-word was said at radio station a month ago, and then at the Capitol. The silence of the non-elected governor, Wanda Vázquez Garcet, is another example on how these colonial bodies continue developing racism in Puerto Rico. So it prevails at state impunity that allows all government institutions to be racist. And I want to add a quote of Marisol, your book that I have right here. When you talk about punitive governance, and you says that, I mean the ways in which the Puerto Rican state has reasserted itself in the lives of Puerto Ricans through technologies of punishment, such as policing and incarceration, as well as the violence, state sanction, and other they often provoke. Punitive governance has left an indelible mark on how life and death are understood and experienced in Puerto Rico, and has done so in a way that reinforces societal inequality along lines of race, class, spatial location, gender, sexuality, and citizenship status. So the link between poverty, Blackness, and location with criminality and danger still is our scenario right now, historically, but still.
Thank you for that, Bárbara. Steven, Luciana, do you want to respond or add?
Yeah, I can. About colonialism and imperialism, I think that for a while, Brazil would not, in terms of a policy, national and international policy, having been so inspired by anti-Blackness policies in the United States than ever. I mean, Brazil has its own technology of racism, especially in neglecting racism and avoiding this political debate about racial disparities in Brazil. But I would like to comment and make a specific point about the current moment that we are living. At this point, all of you guys may know that our president is a copy of Donald Trump. It is really inspired by Donald Trump policies. So the policies who are used to deal with the COVID-19, as soon as we realize that most of the population who are dying are Black populations. So according to the numbers in Brazil, most of the people who have access to hospitals and treatments are white people. But most of the people who are dying are Black people in Brazil. The other element is among the Black population, young people between 25 and 40 have a higher numbers of people who are dying too. So that means mostly workers, people who are going outside and have to work and are using the public transportation, especially domestic workers, that I want to talk specifically about this point in another moment. So the way that Donald Trump has been dealing with COVID-19 in the United States, and the way that Donald Trump has been organizing his political agenda during this moment, ignoring the pandemic, has been a big inspiration for the Brazilian president at this moment. So I think that in this specific moment of a pandemic, Brazil has police brutality, police inequality, numbers of higher unemployment among the Black population. This does not depend on the United States at all. But it's specific about the pandemic, the United States has been a huge inspiration for the policies they are being applied in Brazil, and also how the Brazilian president has been dealing with the crisis created by the debate around the police brutality during this point. The other thing is, in the whole history of Brazil, Brazil has a specific type of white supremacist ideas, very specific, but now the performance of white supremacy that is performed in the United States has been also performed in Brazil by the ultra-conservative groups. So we saw in Brazil parades that look like Ku Klux Klan parades, or the Brazilian president in a official speech drinking glasses of milk. So we see how this performance of white supremacy and racist policies, specifically during the pandemic, and how the support of ultra-conservative groups, racist groups, are being imported from the United States to Brazil during this moment, which is really interesting to see, is really new, considering the specific type of white supremacist narrative that we have in Brazil. Thank you.
I really appreciate you bringing up this kind of point for us to think about, and which I have a feeling Steven is going to get into right now, which is like, how can we actually think about a global fascism or white supremacy is really impacting also how we're thinking about race and policing in this moment. Steven, please.
Yeah, I was going to answer your question by saying, unfortunately, you know, our movements or our struggles oftentimes position them in isolation, as the question about isolating struggles, right? But imperialists and white supremacists don't. Right? They don't separate our struggles. They see our struggles because it's attacking the capital. It's attacking them. Their systemic system that's invading our peoples, right, and attacking our people. You know, and I just want to bring up an example. Like, some of us have heard of Patrick Moynihan. Patrick Moynihan was a famous sociologist, politician, diplomat that wrote an evil document that I'm going to mention. And I just want to preface this by saying, you know, he's a sociologist. I'm a sociologist. One of my mentors, Clyde Woods, always told us that sociology was the operationalization of white supremacy. So I have to contend with that as a sociologist, right? So talking about Patrick Moynihan, you know, when he wrote that report, what's commonly known now as the Moynihan Report in 1967, right? There was an attack on Black women specifically, and then the Black family as dysfunctional, right? A few years later, in 1975, he wrote another report saying the same thing about the Third World and the Third World Project, right? So he was not separating them. He was saying the Black struggle is dysfunctional here, Third World struggle is dysfunctional over there. And it's an attack on us as a system that we need to confront, right? So he recognized that. Now, when we think of Hillary Clinton, calling Black youth super predators in the 90s, and then in 2009, supporting a military coup in Honduras that then led to more of a fascist regime in Honduras, right? She also did not separate it, right? When you think of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden, what did he do? Passed a crime bill in 1994 that he's very proud of. And in 2015, he also wrote and supported this thing called the Alliance for Prosperity for Central America, that further militarized Central America and the attacks of the Garifuna people and other organizations throughout Central America, right? So their connections, they're very clear about their connections of struggles in the US and Latin America, right? So I think for us, we have to build off of that, right? See that, okay, y'all connected, we have to connect these struggles. And I think about like the attacks on the US, the attacks of US foreign policy in Venezuela and Cuba through US sanctions. Who do they affect the most, right? Who are they affecting? The most marginalized communities are affected, right? And we oftentimes don't see that here in the US with our struggles here, right? That when we think of US sanctions on progressive countries or progressive governments with their own contradictions, that is taken away from the struggles of communities here, because the funding, the money that they use to fund these sanctions are being taken away from local community programs, social programs, healthcare, education, right? Because it's funding sanctions and a sanction regime that's killing thousands of people in Venezuela, that's gripping Cuba historically, right? Yet at the same time, we oftentimes see Afro-Venezolanos, Afro-Cubans, and some of the most supporters of a revolutionary process, right? Uplifting the revolutionary process, right? When these last protests in Venezuela were happening, what was going on with the anti-Bolivarian movement? They were burning people, right? And one of them was an Afro-Venezolano that they burned, right? So it was a racist attack on Afro-Venezolanos there. because of their support of a revolutionary process, right? So I think we have to uplift those situations from afar, right? As in the US, I think, yeah. And I think that's something that's difficult to do, going back to that first question, right? When it really relies on movements to uplift it, right? And not in just individuals, right? There's been a lot of conversation about like, how do we confront anti-Blackness in the Latinx community? And it oftentimes focuses on individual processes. Just go talk to your family and work with your family. And that's important. I don't think that's wrong, but we have to elevate it. How do we make that an organizational movement? How do we make that as organizations to push against anti-Blackness, right? Progressive organizations that will support that process, rather than just thinking it as an individual process. And I think it goes back to, again, the neoliberalism in our organizing processes, right? That oftentimes affects that, I think. So, you know, I think that's an important thing to think about. That, you know, I mentioned Moynihan, Clinton, Biden, right? All Democrats, by the way, I think, yeah. We have to not necessarily follow their path, but remember that when they think of our movements, they don't see them separate, right? And we have to think of something in terms of that.
Great, thank you so much, Steven, for that. Important reminders to also, this conversation is about U.S. foreign policy in many ways, right? That's a central part. We can't separate this as these kind of isolated movements, right? So we kind of gestured towards this, but I want to ask a little bit kind of more explicitly, which is, you know, one of the things that makes it really difficult, I think, to discuss the ways that police violence is part of this structure of anti-Black racist violence, whether we're talking here in the US or whether we're talking in Latin America and the Caribbean, is that it presents itself in these incredibly racially neutral ways, right? So much of how police and the media and even how we internalize ideas about policing, right? Which is a point I think a few of you brought up, right? That we also are part of promoting these ideas, even as we're targeted by them in different ways, right? Is the idea that police just go where the crime is, right? They're not targeting Black folks, they're not targeting Indigenous folks, they're not targeting poor folks, right? They're targeting criminals, right? And so this actually makes it really difficult, I think, to pierce that rhetoric for activist movements, right? And to actually show how, despite the ways in which things like mano dura, things like the war on drugs, right? These kind of supposedly race neutral policies, right? Or approaches to fighting crime create these incredibly racist, right, and classist outcomes, right? These incredibly deadly outcomes for racially and economically marginalized people, right? So I want to know, how can we think about this? Like, how can we think about the ways that despite the race neutral casing of these things, they are explicitly racist, right?
So, as I mentioned before, we live in a racist, cis, heteronormative, and patriarchal culture here in Puerto Rico. Every single day we witness how the government goes back in time with the policies they are approving. I also mentioned how some institutions eliminate the race variable from their statistics. And this is a concerted plan to avoid the responsibilities of the state to protect and to guarantee the same right to all Puerto Ricans, Black Dominicans, Black Haitians, principally here in Puerto Rico. Again, under the idea that there's no racism here, the police and the government justify the criminalization and assassination of non-white bodies. For example, I remember after George Floyd assassination, we did a Black Lives Movement vigilia in Loíza, Puerto Rico. Loíza is the town with the most visible Black people in Puerto Rico, self-identify as Black in Puerto Rico. And a lot of people says to us, Colectivo Ilea and other people, that was the first time they were in Loíza, because Loíza is linked to violence, to criminality, and they usually go to the kioscos to have the alcapurria and bacalaíto, but they don't know Loíza per se. And also, we were mentioning in that vigilia that before George Floyd and all the list of people assassinated by the police in the United States, we also have Adolfina Villanueva, assassinated in 1980 in Loíza. So under the idea that there's no reason here, the police and the government justify the criminalization and assassination of non-white bodies. And I say non-white people purposely because that's the way racialization operates right here in Puerto Rico. It's not only skin color, as you discussed in your book, Marisol, but there's other intersectionality. But of course, Black people fill the profile as disproportionate, systematically impoverished and marginalized citizens here in Puerto Rico. And we go outside Puerto Rico as well. We don't have the Mano Dura contra el Crimen anymore, a project imposed by ex-Governor Pedro Rosselló, but still the same pattern of marginalization and criminalization against people who live in special communities, as Ila Calderon imposed, and public housing. Right now, there is no police reform passed or not passed. We are not talking about a reform of the police. We are talking about agreements that should be met in stages over 2 years. In fact, they haven't been fully completed, the first level of that agreement. And Kilómetro Cero, a nonprofit organization, has been working against police brutality and other forms of state violence. And they have evidence of 17 non-white men assassinated by the police since 2019 until today. And I want to mention 3 more cases. In the Alma Yariela Cruz case in December 2016, she was 11 years old, Black girl who was handcuffed and accused for 5 charges of as an adult. And the summer 2019 protests and the assassination of Alexa, a Black trans woman, in February 2020. In all 3, the resistance of the community and the minority group has challenged the police intervention towards social death. So I want to add that, following the question of Lynn, I guess. So there's another movement that we can think about: anti-colonialism, anti-racism. It's not, you know, they criticize the state and the government. We know that they are racist, but there are a lot of people doing a lot of community work being doing in Puerto Rico against those patterns of criminalization, assassination, and racism.
And just to add, you know, something that's really important, I think that you mentioned, that also goes back to our previous point around how can we think about the intersections of empire and colonialism. One of the things that's actually preventing, at least in the case of Puerto Rico, police reform is actually la Junta de Control Fiscal, right? So the fiscal control board that's been imposed in Puerto Rico because of particular laws that are associated with how policy and funding is happening. The police department is not doing reforms, right? And this is work that an organization, which I think we've thrown up in the chat, Kilómetro Cero, is actually actively pursuing, the way that the fiscal control board in Puerto Rico, as a kind of US imposition to discipline through austerity, right? And through austerity that disproportionately affects Black and dark-skinned people in Puerto Rico, are also now exposed to greater police violence because the reforms that the police department needs to do aren't getting done, right? Because it's not deemed as critical and important. So I just also wanted to make that connection that, you know, I think you touched on, that's also critically important for us to see these various layers that are happening. But Luciana, please.
Well, in Brazil, has been really difficult to deny that most of the population who die by police brutality or homicides are Black people, thanks to the institutes of research and the organizations of a Black movement in Brazil. I was just checking 2 numbers to bring to you guys. The last year in a report was, you know, a report brought the information that 75% of the people who are victims of a homicide in Brazil are Black people. And during the pandemic, the police killing of Black populations in Brazil increased 26%. This became a scandal, so the Brazilian Supreme Court ordered that the police actions in the so-called favelas in Brazil be suspended during the pandemic. But in another hand, what we are taught in Brazil, especially by the media and the official speeches through the government and the politicians, is that the killings of the Black people in the favelas, when it's somebody young, like a teenager, is that suspicious of, oh, maybe this person was involved. But when it's the case of a child that happens several times, is a sad and unfortunate consequence of this, the more important struggle against, war against the drugs in Brazil. So this is the speech that is propagated in Brazil, and it is connected with this notion of neutrality. So another idea in Brazil that is connected with this idea of neutrality is really similar to the United States of the bad police officers. So the governments don't embrace the idea, despite all the struggle of the Black movement in Brazil, in serious civil organizations denouncing how systemic racism has been orienting the actions of the police officers, no matter if they are white or Black, how this is a systemic problem. The media, the conservative media, which is the media in Brazil, is controlled by like around the 5 families. And the state says, oh, this is the, unfortunately, but this is because of a bad police officers. So they never embrace this idea that the police is a racist institution and the police officers are trained accord racist protocols. The other thing is that call my attention very much back to our first point about how media try to send a pedagogical message around the George Floyd assassination, is that Brazilian media emphasize a lot how the police officer was a white man. And I was here, this must have an intention about how it was not a police officer. In non-Brazilian news was a police officer, was how a white police officer killed a Black man. And then I understood how this had an intention behind this emphasis on the fact that there was a white police officer, although it was really a white police officer. So in a lot of places, especially the place where I am, the state of Bahia, where over 80% of the population is Black, most of the police officers are white men. So that means, see, it's not a racial problem, since a lot of police officers in some states, the majority of the police officers are Black men. So it's a class thing. It's the result of the war against the, drugs in Brazil. So again, they don't incorporate and recognize how the structure of the police, not the bad or good police officer, but all of them receive a racist training, and they insist in this narrative that the police is neutral, is here to serve the society. It doesn't matter if it's a white or a Black citizen, and the violence and the death of innocents is a sad consequence of the war against the drugs, which is a bigger thing.
Great, thank you so much, Luciana. I know that, Steven, this is a topic that you deal with a lot, both in terms of your research, but also as someone who teaches in a sociology and criminology department, right? Where you have folks who are going into law enforcement that are working class, often, young people of color, right? So please.
I would be glad to say that I don't teach in a critical criminology department, just sociology. So I'm half okay.
My bad.
Half okay. I'm half okay because I don't know if I could survive in a criminology department. But yeah, no, that's an important question, I think, because even in this moment, it's just striking how the police, as much as if you're in our critical radical spaces, we already know what the police is. But when you're around other folks that are not in these spaces, the police is still something that's legitimate. It's still seen as something that, as Luciana was saying, bad apples, right? There's just bad apples that we need to deal with, right? And and when we think of Los Angeles is one of the most quote unquote multicultural police forces in the country, right? Over 50% of it is Latinx, right? And so you have these police officers killing Chicana youth in Boyle Heights, right? And again, it's like the bad apple one, not necessarily the systemic issue, but as Luciana reminds us, right? When we think of the police or policing as a system, it's the purpose of it is to protect and defend private property in a white supremacist social order, right? And I think if we start from that position, as I always tell my students to start from that position, where does that lead us to, right? Where does that take us, right? It doesn't take us to just a reform, because the police itself historically was a reform, right? It was a reform, yeah? So I think that's the part that's really hard for students, as you were saying, you brought up my students, Marisol, to grapple with, right? Especially the ones that want to be police officers, that are working class youth, that see it as a way out, quote unquote, of their communities. That's a constant struggle every day in my classes, where I have youth that see that as an opportunity, right? Or see it as a way to take care of their community, right? Because that's what they've been told all along, right? That even if they themselves don't trust the police, they want to be the police, which is something to really think about, right? But when I think of these policies that you brought up in Mano Dura, the war on drugs, I think those are particular policies and historical conjunctures, but they're all tied to the Monroe Doctrine, to Manifest Destiny, right? To these long historical legacies of white supremacy that tried to act as it wasn't white supremacy, it was progress, right? It was Western civilization, right? And if anything that I've learned from Black studies is that we critique Western civilization, because the project of Black study was the critique of Western civilization and what it brought to this continent, right? So I think when we think of these policies, that's what they are. But I think of, in my work, when I look at the LAPD and El Salvador, particularly, right, in Central America and its involvement, where did they learn their policing tactics? Where did the LAPD learn to repress and control and surveil our communities? It was the Black community, and it was the Chicano community in Los Angeles, right? They learned how to, quote unquote, control gangs, right? And then they exported this idea of gang control to Central America, right? Saying that the problem of El Salvador and Central America were maras, right? When we know for sure that the problem wasn't maras at first, maybe it's a current condition that people are dealing with now, but it was US imperialist expansion in Central America, right? It was wars, counterinsurgency in Central America, right? So I think, when we look at these policies, they're tied to this, but even to this day, in El Salvador, they have what's called the International Law Enforcement Agency, the ILEA, which is an agency that trains police officers throughout Latin America, right? And who's training them? US officials, US police, right? Teaching them tactics of counterinsurgency, or what some people call community policing, right? Which we all know is counterinsurgency, right? But it's the argument of community policing. But what's funny, when I was in El Salvador and you ask police officers about community policing, they laugh because they're like, we don't do that. We're here to repress and control. They know their role, right? So even as much as we think of community policing, it is repression. Some people are even hostile, police are hostile to that because they think they have to go policing light, right? But we know that, again, community policing is not that, right? It is counterinsurgency. And when we think of how these policies, policing tactics, whether they be gang injunctions, broken windows policing, right, stop and frisk, right, these policies that they argue are race neutral, right? What Robin Kelly reminds us in Policing the Planet in this book chapter, that is what he calls, colorblind violence, right? This idea of colorblind violence, right? That no, this is not racist. This is just the fact that y'all are more prone to crime. And so if you're more prone to crime, we have to police the areas where there's crime, right? But at the Los Angeles Community Action Network, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, they've shown us that the data that the police use is fundamentally racist, right? Because they're using data that's already racist. So this data then is used to argue that it's race neutral, right? And then you export these forms of policing into specific places that have their own historical particularities that then get applied in their own ways, right? And I think that's what you do, Marisol, in your book, right? Show how these policies are implemented in Puerto Rico in this particular way, though, the mano dura, right? That you argue, just like in El Salvador, the mano dura, right? That's how me and Marisol met, talking about mano dura, right? But in its particularities of mano dura, again, right? When we think of Central America and the argument that we need it. So in this current moment, you see Presidente Bukele, people accepting him because he's supposedly his mano dura is okay, because we got to get rid of MS-13, right? And the same argument that he makes is the same argument that Donald Trump makes. Is the same argument that Bolsonaro makes, right? So again, I think about this idea that fascists and imperialists see everything the same, and we have to fight that, right? And so, you know, I think that in this moment, these policies, we have to call it out, right? That they're uplifting and defending private police specifically, are defending private property in all its manifestations, and right, in a white supremacist social order. And I think that shouldn't be controversial to say, right? That should be a good sense, right? A good sense of how we should constantly say that. Again, my students, when you say that, their eyes open up, because they're like, how is it a white supremacist if the police officers in my neighborhood look like me? And it's kind of like what Luciana's bringing up, right? That's not white supremacists. They look like me, right? But it's a reminder that this is structural, right? And so, yeah, I think, you know, that's how we have to make sense of this, right? We have to make sense of this through a structural analysis of the problem.
Yeah, I think your point around, and this is something that, you know, I also deal with my students, right? And doing kind of work around policing and questions of abolition, right? Is like, how do we move from this kind of bad apples perspective, right? That this is like what we're seeing as a result of individual animus, right? Or that it's just white police that we have to worry about, right? Instead of that it's a structural way in which it's preconditioned by the kind of racial function of the police, right? As inserting people into particular racial hierarchies, which is not what we think the police do, right? We think the police are about safety and justice, and it's about protecting capital, right? And if we think about capital as also a racial project, right? Then these two things go hand in hand. I just want to give a quick shout out to a friend of NACLA and friend of some folks here, which is Stuart Schrader, has an amazing book called Badges Without Borders, where he actually traces some of these kind of connections in terms of how a lot of how police operate is based on military kind of logics and practices that then gets transformed into bringing, you know, what's counterinsurgency abroad, right? In places like Vietnam and in Latin America to the streets of the US and calling it community policing. And that's something that, you know, as Steven said, we had connected over previously because although I never wrote about it because I couldn't find enough info, but after the transition to democracy in El Salvador, the first people in there to train the police were Puerto Rican police officers. They were sent specifically to train police officers in El Salvador about community policing at the same moment that, as Bárbara mentioned, right, that they're going into low-income and racially marginalized communities to enact violence, right, and to enact repression. So these kind of circuits, I think, are really important for us to kind of think about in terms of how police training happens and the ways that affects and bridges us together, right, across the hemisphere, right, and connects these struggles, right? So as, you know, Steven, as you noted, right, fascists and white supremacists are connected, and these policing, you know, bodies are also connected, and so we have to be connected in order to fight that. And so that's gonna bring me to my last question before we transition to Q&A. I just want to remind folks to please send in your questions using either the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll address them for the remainder of our time together. But the last question that I wanted to talk about is precisely touching on this point, which is, for me as someone who is in the diaspora, grounded in an experience that is very much of the diaspora and tries to do work between Latin America and US communities of color, it's been really amazing to see in this moment how this has created opportunity for solidarity and connection between Latin America and the diaspora around these questions of racial justice. So I want to ask you all just to comment briefly on what do you all see as the role of the diaspora in these struggles against state violence and racism in Latin America and vice versa, right? So what are some of the ways in which we can think about this movement transnationally, and what are the lessons that we have for each other, right? In coming from a place of solidarity.
Okay, so I think the role of the Latinx diaspora in the US is crucial. I've been participating in some conversations with Puerto Ricans in Florida, New York, and California, particularly in the past few weeks. And although there's a lack of information of how things happen in the archipelago, when you talk, them seem surprised. For example, I was talking with people from Florida, and they were surprised because people in Puerto Rico mark as white in the census. And I said, well, Puerto Ricans in Florida, 95% choose the white answer too. So this is nothing that happens only on the archipelago. Latinos in general do the same in the United States. So I think there's a disconnection, not necessarily conscious, but there's a disconnection of what's happening in the country. I think it's also something that has to do with the negotiations that we have when we are, outside our countries. But there's a huge capacity and strong will to get organized. Also, they are hungry to help and to contribute. After May 25th and the Blackout Tuesday, June 2, 2020, a month ago, Colectivo ILE has been receiving donations from people outside the island and fundraising events being organized dedicated to Colectivo ILE anti-racist work. It's difficult to recognize that in a pandemic and after the assassination of a Black man, our anti-racist work has duplicated in that kind of a scenario, but we need to take advantage of the juncture to continue what we have been doing for years. We need to create transnational alliances. If the anti-racist work in our countries goes unrecognized and not dealt with, we should establish connection with other nations in the Caribbean, Latin America, Latinx communities all over the United States. I think it is important to surpass the basic level of recognition of the existence of racism and to find a point of unity. Of course, each nation has its own particularities, but we need to think strategically as a whole. In 2020, this should be an international anti-racist project of the Global South, I think.
Thank you for that. Luciana, Steven, please.
I kind of got lost with the question because I was taking my notes and can you repeat again?
Yeah, for sure. So, how can we kind of think about this moment transnationally, right? And I think in particular, how can we think about the role of, the kind of diaspora in being a part of these struggles?
Okay, I was taking notes about this question. I forgot. I think that in academia, we are promoting a lot of the discussions and trying to understand this moment as part of the legacy of racism and post-abolition policies and the imperialism in these countries, how they are developing, and especially during the pandemic, how they are developing new technologies of exploitation and violence of Black people. But my personal opinion is that still the organizations need to have a closer dialogue in a way that we understand that what happened in Brazil, in United States, in Dominican Republic, and in Puerto Rico is not a coincidence. Now, all this is connected. I'm saying this because frequently I see, for example, in United States media, people saying, oh, this violence against the Black population doesn't happen in no other nation in the Americas or in the globe, and this is not true. Because I'm like, this is not true. We could gain much more if we have a closer dialogue, understanding why this type of technologies, in the same time that they repeat itself in these places, they follow the same protocol, they are so cruel, they adapt to each nation. I was really shocked at like last week of the killing of a trans woman in Dominican Republic. And I was in the model of how the assassination happened, by the way, also by the police, was really similar to what happened in Brazil against the trans population. By the way, is the country in the universe that kills more trans people, among any other nation. So if we have had a closer dialogue, I don't believe that this will be done by the mainstream media, but the alternative media, the political media, and the organizations. We could gain much more. I think that we are doing a great job as academics. We are doing these debates, but the organizations, the grassroots organizations, don't have to depend on academics telling them that this model of oppression repeats itself in several places. I think the language is still a challenge, especially in Brazil, because we are the only ones who speak Portuguese in the Americas. But it's something that has to be done. I think that today we have, internet and the technology that can be used to make this dialogue close. But I think that we much stronger, and we will have a better understanding if we realize how these technologies of oppression, exploitation of work, and violence repeat itself in several nations in the Americas.
So as I mentioned, as you mentioned in my bio, right, I'm a member of a grassroots organization called the Human Rights Alliance for Child Refugees and Families, which is a grassroots organization of Central Americans that want to uplift the rights of refugees, in the border. And one thing that always inspires me, that always reminds me of this question that you asked, Marisol. There was a moment during a hunger strike in one of the detention centers here in the US. And that hunger strike was organized and led by Haitians and Salvadorans, right? They came together under those conditions, right? Those abusive, horrific conditions of cages in the detention center, to recognize their mutual dignity, right? To fight for their freedom, right? Two distinct people, with similar conditions. They might not even have spoken almost a similar language. Although some Haitians I've met that have been refugees have learned Spanish throughout the process of migrating through Latin America, right? But they organize themselves. And we wanted to uplift that. And that's always a reminder to me of how do we build solidarity under conditions that want to divide us, right? Because obviously the system works when we're divided. It's fundamental, right? Audre Lorde talked about that, divide and conquer, right? It's perfect for the system to work that way, right? So I think for us to uplift that, to think of our movements as transnationally, from the US specifically, because that's what I'm speaking from Los Angeles, we have to take an anti-imperialist perspective in the work we do when we're in the US. Obviously, Latin America, countries in Latin America already lead the way in that. They've been speaking about anti-imperialism. They've been talking to us about Yankees go home, right? But we're in the US oftentimes get focused on our struggles here. So I think we have to uplift an anti-imperialist struggle in the work we do, even if it's local, right? And for me personally, when I think about an anti-imperialist perspective, I think of an internationalism that's foundational from an anti-racist Marxist tradition, right? That historically an anti-racist Marxist tradition has had this attitude of being anti-imperialist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, right? The work of Angela Davis, Ruthie Gilmore, right? Let's go farther back to Claudia Jones. These folks have uplifted this perspective and reminding us transnationally that what our communities are affected across these borders, right? And I think that's an important place to be at, right? That I think we have to uplift that. I know organizations that do that. I think, for example, the International League of People's Struggles is currently going to have a discussion with the National Alliance Against Racist and Police Repression on the effects of rebellions here and sanctions in Iran. What are the relationships between police violence in the US and sanctions in Iran? There's a connection, as Luciana and Barbara were talking about, right? But we oftentimes don't see that connection. And I think as organizers, as academics, as activists, it's our role to uplift that. We need to call out the tensions and the contradictions within our communities. But as organizers, we don't stay there. Our purpose is to unite the many against the few, right? And oftentimes we get stuck and just want to call out. But let's call out, but let's also build and organize. And we all have a role in that. So in the diaspora, we have to uplift that.
Great, thank you all for these wonderful responses. So we have a bunch of great questions from the audience. The first one I want to ask, which is, we got here on the chat, which is, what should people be, especially because we've been kind of critiquing mainstream media, and what if people want to find out more about these struggles? Where can they go? What organizations? What sites? Just if you could quickly just mention a few. We can try and also put them in the chat so people can get easier access to them. But what should people be following and looking out for?
You already mentioned Colectivo Ile, Kilómetro Cero. Also, there's a lot of people in Puerto Rico, individuals like Mayra Santos Febres, the literature writer. Also, Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, who is an Afro-Puerto Rican lesbian woman, who has a hashtag Ennegrece tu prontuario, like put black your syllabus. And she's talking about protagonismo, to talk about Black people in Puerto Rico right now. And Colectivo Ile, you can go to the website, also follow us in Instagram and Facebook, but also Negras, the radio program. There's the podcast. There's a lot of podcasts. I have been listening to a lot of podcasts los últimos días, the last days. And I think that, as Steven was saying, we are focused on the media, the commercial media, but there's a lot of other resources that we have. After the assassination of George Floyd, there's a lot of bibliographic, people are sharing lists of books, of cuentos, story for kids, but also those stories for kids are for adults as well, in the level we are. So we can start doing that, watching movies. There's a lot of things. We don't have excuses to say that we don't know how to deal with this, with racism in Puerto Rico or in the diaspora. We have no excuses to continue saying that this is something that happened there. It doesn't happen with me. It doesn't important for me. So I think there's a lot of resources that we have available.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that in Brazil today we can follow. I will type in the chat the names, but the Coalizão Negra por Direitos is a Black coalition, is a group of several different organizations in Brazil that jump into the debate on democracy. Because now in Brazil, you know, the society has been debating a lot about how democracy has been threatened in Brazil since we are almost living a civilian, military dictatorship. So the Black coalition has been pointing that there is no any chance of debating democracy without debating racism in Brazil, systematic racism in Brazil. There is also Rede de Mulheres Negras, which is Black Women Network in Brazil. Affirmative Magazine, Revista Afirmativa, is a group of Black journalists who are developing a new type of media in Brazil. Instituto Guerra 10 is also an important organization. And the Campanha Reaja, has a long time action in denouncing police brutality, but also in prisonal system in Brazil. I will type it here. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Steven, any recommendations?
Yeah, I think, you know, for me here in the US, I think something that places that I've been getting my news and just reading lately has been, for example, the Black Alliance for Peace. This organization, I think, started 3 years ago, but I've been talking about AFRICOM, right? And the development of US military bases in Africa, right? So the Black Alliance for Peace. I think, you know, Black Agenda Report, right? I think they oftentimes have some really good articles and news that cover from the perspective of the left in the US. Even simple things as Democracy Now, right? If you want to talk about not watching Univision or watching CNN, just go to Democracy Now. They have a podcast for an hour and they give you the news, and it might be from the liberal view, but at least it's not CNN, right? And so I think that's important, and they oftentimes have good speakers on there, right? So I think that's a good way to look at it. You know, locally, when you look at grassroots organizations, for me, I think, you know, Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA CAN, right? They just released a report called on COVID-19 and its effects on women in Skid Row, right? LA CAN, you know, a really good organization to look at if you're thinking about gentrification and houselessness in Los Angeles, right? And again, I mentioned the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, who's having that webinar on its relationship to policing in the US and sanctions in Venezuela, which I'll post in the chat as well. But I think, you know, those are places to look at, you know, and for me to, you know, and my friends, you know, always laugh, but I say, I hear these things, but I also wish to listen to Fox News, because you got to hear how these guys are thinking, you know, and you know, as a cancer survivor, my friends are worried that I'm going to get another tumor from watching them, but you have to watch what the enemy's saying, just understand the logic, even though it's illogical what they're saying, understand how do we respond to these statements that oftentimes my students are saying, right, as unconsciously are saying, right? Because then if you ask them, did you watch Fox News? No, I didn't, but they're pretty much saying what Fox News is saying. So I think, you know, to challenge these things is important. But again, I think the ones I mentioned are important resources for us to listen to and see their perspectives. But again, I'll post that link on there.
Great, thank you all for those awesome recommendations. I have a question here for Luciana and Bárbara. What does the incorporation of feminist frameworks within resistance of white supremacy, imperial neoliberal desires, and state/police violence look like in your respective work? So I think this question of how can we specifically think from a feminist, which I know both of you are do in your research and your activism, how can we think with a feminist perspective on these questions and issues?
In my case, the very basic fact that when I enter in the classroom as a Black woman, kind of young woman, changed the view of my students. And it's like, who is she? Now with the media, this is different from maybe 5 years ago. Now they look at me and I saw like academia.edu, like they're looking for who I am. But even though that happened, I see the treatment they have with me, and the difference between if I was a white man, how was the reaction of them. So sometimes they ask me, what is the anthropological canon, professor? And I said, there's a lot of canons. And the one you are going to learn in this class is from a Black woman perspective. So I do what Yolanda Arroyo says, the ennegrecer el prontuario, cite Black women, and add another voices that is not the white canon that they are accustomed to. And also I learned the first day of class, I start with the exercise del paseo de los privilegios, asking them, have you been stopped by the police when you go to the pharmacy? And I put everybody in the class in a line, and I start asking that questions, and they start moving forward or backward. And that helped me a lot for the rest of the semester to think about these topics that sometimes they say, Professor Abadia, this is the first time that I know what is racialization, that we talk about race. And if we are, I was working at the University of Puerto Rico in the sociology and anthropology department. If we're teaching about sociology and anthropology, how we cannot teach about race in a political way, not in a, I know that not in a biological way, but so this is something that surprised me. And I always say to them, for me to be here in this scenario, I have to surpass a lot of barriers. So I have to talk about myself. I have to talk about my subjectivity, how I position myself in the topics that I know I want them to know and to learn. So I try to do what other colleagues says, antropología fugitiva, activist anthropology, fugitive anthropology, decolonial anti-racist anthropology, as not only to tell them we should not be racist, we should be anti-racist people. And this is the way that I try to teach my classes. This is the way that I try to prepare them, to ask in incómodas, like, ¿cómo se dice incómodas? Questions, like
uncomfortable questions and talk about everything in my classes. This is the thing that I recommend other people, as at least everybody should do that. But sometimes we as minorities, we have a lot of like, I don't know if I should be doing that or not. So I do it. I don't care, because I own this place, because and I try to do classes in a conversation in the same level. I'm not the professor right here and you are there. So I learn a lot with my students, and I show them that I'm learning as well that I'm teaching. And that helps me a lot in the process of the knowledge, aprendizaje process.
Well, I teach in a university, Bahia and Recôncavo, where it's a university that has just 15 years. So my university was founded with affirmative action. So I'm in a humanity campus, so most of our students, especially in history courses, are Black students. So I have really deep experiences being a Black professor, a Black woman, you know, from working class families, who is a professor, but also is really interesting, and sometimes I can tell painful, see how racism affected the mind of the students, how it's difficult for them to realize that they have no mammy, no the oldest sister, no a cousin, not the neighbor, not the mother, but a black woman who is a, I'm seeing Barbara doing this, and I'm sure that she understands what I'm talking about. But I would like to talk briefly about my experience during the pandemic, because my students and even some of the colleagues were like, oh, it's not my job to say anything during the pandemic because I'm not chemistry, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a doctor. But since the beginning in Brazil, the first person who died of COVID-19 was a black woman, a domestic worker. And now one of the big issues in Brazilian society is the working conditions of domestic workers. I just assume I received the information that Brazil is the country that still uses a lot the work of the domestic workers, more than 70% black women. So during this time that I was debating with my students, you know, I think that my role as a black woman from working classes is to show them how still, even the pandemic didn't level everybody, how from an intersectional and black feminist point of view, as black intellectuals, as black women, we can see still how misogyny, patriarchalism, and racism operates during the pandemic. So most of the people who are dying and getting sick are black women who are going to take care of isolated families, understanding that domestic worker not as a human being who should be away of these privileged families who are getting sick. So this has been my role during this pandemic, is both with the students and in media, is to show how racism, patriarchalism, and gender policies has been, even during the pandemic, affecting black women more. In general, most of the people who are affected are men, but in the communities in Brazil, in the so-called favelas, most of the people who are getting sick are women, because there is a lot of domestic workers there, and they are the ones who are using the public transportation and taking care of these privileged families who are getting sick. So this has been how I have been using, you know, black feminist theories in order to approach the current moment in my work.
Great, thank you so much for those responses. So we have a question here. I'd love to hear from all the panelists about borderlands in terms of empire, nation, fleeing persecution, migration, dodging different nations' version of discrimination. Can these places be anti-colonial, transnational, or do they just highlight racial capitalism and nationalism? So how can we think about questions of borders in relation to these issues, and of these kind of spaces, these borderland spaces, right, where we see these processes colliding and up close?
I could go first. So again, I think you know what I shared earlier about the organized struggle of Salvadorans and Haitians at that moment, at the border, right, in the detention centers. I think, you know, those are sites where we see these transnational struggles. Now I think it's always have to respond, well, what's the border like? I think if you think of Mexico, for Central Americans, that's like an extended border, right? It's like, it's not horizontal, you know, it's almost vertical in a way, right? That they have the entire Mexico is a border for them to cross, right? And there's been a lot of people discussing this issue, right? Of the racism towards Central Americans in Mexico, towards Haitians in Mexico, right? And also the organizing of certain sectors of Mexican society to support migrants in that process. And I think that's where you see these issues that we've been talking about, right? That the militarization of borders and its effects on people, you know, and even when smaller countries start to militarize their borders, you know, the case of El Salvador now has an actual border patrol. Historically, it's never had a border patrol. Now it has a border patrol, right? These quote unquote safe third country agreements that are created between Trump and Central American countries, right? These are the things that we're seeing, how these borders are being developed, you know? And when I think of Mexico, I just have this book here next to me, actually, you know, that's fundamental. We have to think about it, you know? It is, we have to understand how Mexico has been a project of mestizaje, as we were talking about earlier, right? And how that needs to be challenged at the material conditions, right? The level of the material conditions, not just ideologically, right? How it affects sectors of society in Mexico and groups that are crossing through Mexico. So I think that's an important thing of thinking about the borders, but I wouldn't separate thinking about racial capitalism within the borders, right? I don't think there's two separate things. I think it's embedded, right? When we think of the project of borders, it's fundamentally a racial project, right? But it's a racial capitalist project, right? Of managing and controlling profits and surplus, right? Not only surplus labor, but surplus capital, right? And so I think that's an important point to build from. Thanks for that question, though. It's important to think about the border, right? And how we see these policies implemented and its effects on people.
Yeah, and for folks who are interested, this is actually something also the NACLA, we've been doing some work about this on our blog and in the magazine as well, to check out, you know, I think the points that kind of Steven is making here, the ways in which, particularly from a US perspective, we tend to think about kind of immigration policing and violence and borders as a very Latino issue, right? And with all of the kind of mestizaje narratives that's baked into that, right? When we know that Black immigrants, right, and the violence, the particular violence that they experience through border enforcement, through the kind of planned violence of crossing, right, and the kind of intensification of border regimes, they're hit particularly hard, right, in terms of migrants from Latin America. But we also know that in Mexico right now, there is a huge number of African migrants who are kind of being held at the border, right, and subjected to particular violence there. And we can think about this again within a kind of not only hemispheric perspective, but also a global perspective, right? If we think about kind of what's happening in the Mediterranean as well, right? And how that actually connects, I think, precisely to some of the issues that you're bringing up, Steven. So we have a question here that I think is a really interesting one, right? Because I think, you know, we're all, you know, educators, we're academic scholars, but we're mostly teaching at the college level, right? And so one of the questions here was, how can I bring this knowledge that struggles in Latin America intersect with struggles like BLM to my high school students, especially my Latinx students who don't feel connected to the struggle, right? So I think one of the things is like, how do we, you know, not only make this a kind of curricular ethnic studies project that is something that people have to wait till they get to college to learn, but how is this something that we can actually integrate holistically within the education system? So I don't know if folks have opinions or thoughts.
That really, you know, reflexive question. But one of the things is taking in consideration the students that I know, that I'm familiar with. If they don't have very well developed the racial, gender, and class identities, they will be stuck with the nationality, which is really interesting to elites and political power, and it will be more difficult for them to understand the struggles of the diaspora. I think that, you know, the way that we teach history, maybe we, but in general, teaching history, emphasizing too much the national identities, makes more difficult for those students, especially those of public schools and working classes students, to understand that they struggle for freedom, for equality has been happening in other places, also in Europe, in African continent, and in the Americas. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. I think we should start earlier, not in high school. I think we should start in elementary level. As I was mentioning before, the books of Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, Pelo Bueno, Mejorar la Raza, Papapedia, is like a Wikipedia, but the father who taught the kids about stories. And I also think, as Luciana said, we have to reflect on that question, because even in my level at undergrad students, I still struggling how I can educate them about these topics. But also, I think students are so creative. We can change the curriculum and add, if you would like to sing, write a song about this topic, or if you would like to draw something about. And we are learning about Black people as slaves. Why we don't write a story about the other story? As Chimamanda says, the danger of a single story. How can we teach them other stories? Go to the internet and search about Africa as a continent. How many countries have Africa, or how many universities has Africa? Look at the date when they started. The first university was in Africa. Why we don't teach that? Why we don't teach this kind of, so I think we should be creative with students and adding new forms to teach about these topics. But I think, as I said before, start in an elementary level, since in the family, we are not talking about this. So in some place we need to start, and it's hard to continue starting to talk about this at the university level.
Yeah, and I think, for example, I'm not sure the person asking the question is if they work at a public school, right? And how strict the curriculum of a public school is, that doesn't allow space to have these conversations, right? I have a friend, a comrade of mine, that she teaches at South Central and is doing amazing work talking about the genocide in Guatemala. She's figured out a way of incorporating that into her social studies curriculum, right? And so I think the ingenuity and the strategy of teachers that want to see do better for their students, figure out a way of doing it. I think for myself, I said earlier that I'm a student of the Black radical tradition. Well, it didn't start by just reading. It started by listening to music, right? By listening to hip hop, to listening to the blues. That, as a younger kid, that's what it was teaching me. Now, obviously, there's a lot of contradictions in hip hop that I had to unlearn as an adult, but there was also a lot of things that taught me, that really shaped me how I think about the world to this day, right? So I think, popular culture with all its baggage can be used for ways of teaching and knowing, right? So, I think about in my classes when I teach Ida B. Wells, right? What are we listening to? Well, we listen to Strange Fruit, right? We listen to music to show the popular culture, right? Through the literature. So I think that's one way. Again, I go back to that when I think of the Black radical tradition, what taught me first was music, right? And actually later on, first listening to the lyrics, like my students always get stuck on KRS's ones, there can never be justice on stolen land, right? We listened to this in my critical criminology class. There can never be justice on stolen land for them. And they get stuck there. I'm like, okay, what does that mean to then become a police officer, right? What are you gonna do now, right? Now, I can only imagine them doing that with youth, right? I participate in the summer. I oftentimes, there's a summer program here near me that they ask me to speak every year to do like an introduction to sociology class. And it's all high school students that are going to be entering the university, and they want to do kind of like a mock lecture. So one thing I oftentimes have them read beforehand, before we meet, is Paulo Freire's The Act of Study. It's only 5 pages, really short, right? But the idea of politicizing study, right? And not just seeing it, that you take it just to do a test, right? That you study just to pass a class, but to study the world, to study politically, right? The world. And then I remind them, then if you could do this with books, you could do this with music. You could do this with what you're watching on TV. You could do this with everything around you, right? So I think with high school students, you know, we could start at the very young age, but even with high school students, the Act of Study, it's only 5 pages, you know. And I learned about the Act of Study from a Cuban political educator that was in El Salvador doing political education, right? She told me, I use the Act of Study with Salvadoran peasants, right? And we talk about their conditions. And that blew my mind. I'm like, well, if you could do it here, why can't I do it in my classrooms, right? And you know, I'm always gonna be inspired by that, right? So I think it's figuring out ways that we could use the system itself, like for example, popular culture, and subvert it in its head for our struggles. The title is The Act of Study by Paulo Freire.
Thank you for those responses. So we're getting low on time, unfortunately, because I feel like I could just stay here and talk with you all and learn with you all evening. But I want to kind of close with this question, which is about, you know, which I think for folks who work on policing and work on police violence, this is a question that we get a lot, right? Which is, where's the hope, right? So the question what are the kind of bright spots? So we have a question here that says, we hear much about the challenges of anti-Blackness and the police, but I'm curious to know if any of you have come across specific municipalities and or communities that appear to have the structure and foundations in place that provide a bit of hope throughout these times. Are there any signs of slow, sustainable improvements in communities, municipalities, et cetera, that we can look towards? So where are you all finding hope in these moments?
Oh, everybody's quiet.
I'm waiting for y'all to go first.
A sense of hopelessness has descended on
No, not at all.
Oh, it has been so difficult. I have been finding a lot of the hope with the youth, because they, although particularly I think is a generation, when I say the generation, I'm talking about the 20s. They read much less than my generation, but they have audacity and courage and comfortable with the technology that, for example, you know, my generation we didn't have when I was 20 something. So they have a strong sense of rights, and they have a strong definition on their mind that they cannot take it anymore, and they will not give up and go back to the places where, you know, the elites want them to go back to. This giving me a lot of hope. And I have a 5-year-old son, and he gives me a lot of the hope too, that we have to make changes that maybe I don't see. I hope that he, you know, take advantage, not only him, of course, but the children of his generation take advantage of the efforts that we are doing today.
You know, again, I think I'm always reminded of a communist intellectual from Italy named Antonio Gramsci that talked about pessimism of intellect, optimism of will, right? You could be pessimistic of the world, you could be pessimistic of the conditions, but you always have to be optimistic of will, of the ability for grass movements to organize the possibility of an alternative, right? We have to think of those two things dialectically. Sometimes we do get caught up in the pessimism, and I'll be one of them to admit that. But you also have to continue to believe in the grassroots organizations, the people's movements that are still going. You know, I mentioned that I'm a member of the Philippine-US Solidarity Organization that's in solidarity with the people's movements in the Philippines. Right now, Rodrigo Duterte, who's another fascist next to Bolsonaro, right, passed a so-called anti-terror bill to target social movements and people's movements, right? Now, it is a very dangerous, very deadly law that's going to be passed, right? That's going to really legitimize martial law, right? So, but what, instead of seeing the movements decrease, they've upped their game to respond, right? And that to me is inspiring, right? That you see these struggles in the global South that continue, right? When you think of Cuba, you know, and the fact that it's had a sanction for so long, yet are providing healthcare around the world, right? To me, that's inspiring, right? When you see these migrants that I mentioned, these refugees organizing themselves against their conditions, that's inspiring, right? So I think I have to look at these spaces that oftentimes corporate media doesn't show us, right? To be inspired. Luciana brought up domestic workers. My mother was a domestic worker until she retired. Her whole life she worked as a domestic worker. That was inspiring to me, that she was able to raise my brother and I on her own as a domestic worker. If she continued, despite those conditions, with optimism, what right do I have to be pessimistic? You know what I mean? And I think that's vital to me to remember. So yeah, so I think, you know, the dialectic of pessimism and optimism has to be waged.
So I think that even though sometimes I feel like I'm doing this work as an anti-racist leader because all the pain that I have been feeling, and my mother, my ancestors, and a lot of people in my family, Black people in my family, I do see hope in young people, in young, as Luciana said. For example, I remember one of the Negras program that we have for young people, young women, and the two youngest, less than 15 years old, they were reading poems of Ángela María Dávila. A lot of adults in Puerto Rico don't know who was Ángela María Dávila. And they were like reciting that poems with that power that was amazing. And I see hope in young people in Puerto Rico. And also I see hope in Black Latinas No Collective, Black Women Movement, and in this sorority that has been, always have been there, but now, fortunately with the social media, we have in Instagram, in Twitter. So I see hope in young people, and also in the movement of women, Black women particularly, and brown women as well.
Thank you all, and I'm happy we get to end a little bit on a hopeful note, because I think it is one of the challenges of doing this work, because it is detailing these painful occurrences, and trying to find a way out, right? And so I think that I'm happy we could kind of end with these thoughts about what's making us feel optimistic in this moment. So I want to thank everyone, all the panelists, for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you to everyone who joined us in terms of the attendees. If you missed part of it, or you know someone who might be interested in this conversation, we'll be putting this up on NACLA's YouTube page. This recording will be available later. So thank you, and please check out NACLA.org and all of the recommendations that the panelists made. I hope everyone has an excellent night. Take care.
Gracias.